Hello and welcome everyone. It's another weekly Q&A from my Scratch Academy. This week, so you can come on, you can ask any questions at all, so just stick them in the chat, whatever channel you're on. This is across TikTok, Twitch, Facebook, Insta and YouTube. You get the best view anywhere that isn't TikTok, basically. TikTok's a little bit more complicated, but you get an above shot as well on Twitch or whatever. So the handle is at Mr. Big Mouth Beats across any of those platforms. So yeah, feel free to come and check it out. But you can ask any question you like. What I'm going to go through today is some questions that have come up over the week, largely around making scratching as musical as possible. And there are a few tricks that I'm kind of going to go through. I'm going to start just by doing a little bit more scratching to get people involved while people are joining. Starting to see a few more people turning up. Give us a shout in the chat if you're around. Yeah, any questions you got, just jump in. Okay, let's get into business. So, you got a few things that you can basically do when you're trying to make trying to make scratching as musical as possible. The things that generally matter. So the inspiration for all of this comes basically from melodies in in pop music, right? So if you think about when you're hearing pop music, some pop music, you feel like you already know it even though it's the first time that you've heard it. And it's because the composer of that piece of music pulled upon a few tricks, right? And the first of those tricks is repetition. Humans, right? We like familiarity. Familiarity fills us with positive feelings. It's why students who lived at the bottom of a set of stairs in their halls tended to have more friends, better relationships, and tended to get it on with more people, largely because their face was familiar. Anybody who had to come past, had to go up any of the flights of stairs or anything to get to their halls would know those people, right? And it's the same thing in music. Anything that sounds familiar will be met with a kind of positive response. So the first thing that they often do is repetition. I'm going to choose a slightly slower beat for this. Yeah, let's go with that. So here's an example, right? Let's just use some repetition. Right, I bet by the third one of those you were like, I know what's coming. And you're starting to hear that rhythm in your head. Right? And that's exactly what you want your audience to have. If you want it to be memorable, you want it to be exciting, you want it to be interesting and accessible to your audience, repetition's a really great place to start. Now, the thing that's tricky is, right, like a lot of scratching you're doing freestyle, right? You're doing it in the moment and it's like, right, okay, cool. So you do need to have some sort of stock patterns that you typically go to try and manage that. So, do have your kind of natural things in your pocket that you can at least start with, and then try and repeat them. And I always try to kind of think about like, what are the kind of simple things I can do to keep it fresh, keep it going, but also then, I do like some repetition and then a little bit of variation. So it's actually quite easy to think through. So, other examples might be this. Right, you see how the first example I gave you was just pure repetition of a phrase. There I've actually got 4 phrases, right? And I'm repeating nearly all of the notes in both of those, but there's some slight variation. But it still gives the listener like the impression that they kind of know what's coming. And so repetition's a critical one to include, right? Have a few stock kind of, stock patterns up your sleeve for using for different things. Now, the next one that's really, really popular is call and return. I remember I watched a masterclass by Hans Zimmer, the guy who made like all the famous film scores that you could possibly think of. And he talks about music as being a conversation, right? So he's like, you've got a question being asked and then a question being answered. And so if you start to break down your phrases into question and response, and then layer in that repetition, you get something that's really, really musical. So I'll give you an example, something like this. So in that scenario, I've got question, right? And then I've got response, which is something like this. Okay. And so I can keep asking the same question over and over again. So, and getting different responses. Here we go. Question. Response. Question. Response. Question. Response. See how you start to get this kind of musicality to it. Something, and then something says it back. Something says it back. Now, that's prevalent across, like, not just film scores. That's prevalent in blues, in jazz, in pop, in everywhere. So it's a really, 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 really good technique for making it all sound musical. Now, the key thing, of course, is like you can combine those two things together, right? So you can have a question that you ask several times and then a response, right? So you could have something like this. So there I had a structure that would be known as A, B. So I did the same thing 3 times and then I followed it with an answer, right? So you can try that. So if you've got like a pattern that you like, do it 3 times and then do it slightly differently, something like this. Okay, hopefully you're hearing that. I was repeating 3 things and then changing it for the last one. And so it's really nice because basically what happens is the listener goes, I hear the first one, okay. They hear the second one, it's the same. So they go, oh, brilliant, I know the third one. And then the moment that they go to put the third one in, they get that kind of satisfaction that they put the third, and then there's a change. This is a really nice structure for keeping a listener engaged and keeping them interacting with your music and your scratching. It's also quite nice and easy from a freestyling perspective, right? Because, like, you know, at the end of the day, you're really only coming up with 2 riffs, but you're getting 4 bars out of it, which is kind of handy. But it does mean you do have to kind of have a stock starting point, and we'll talk about that in a moment as well. But so covered a little bit there about, you know, A, B. What about some different ones? So what you could have is you could have A, B, A, C. So you've got the same question being asked, the A, and then you've got 2 different responses. So that might be something like this. You see? There I had questions were the same, or close, kind of the same. And then there were 2 different variations, created different things. Now, one thing to think about when you're doing variations, right, is if you listen to like popular melodies, what you'll find is that there's a way of kind of ending a first phrase and ending a second phrase. And like one of the best tricks is to just kind of go up or down in pitch. Now, when you're scratching, the only way you can really do that is to push your hand a bit further for higher pitches, and a bit slower for lower pitches. But you can do the same principle. So you can just repeat the same pattern, but then have a high ending followed by a low ending. So something like this. You see, those phrases were really, really close to each other, like almost identical. The difference was the last note. One went higher pitched and then one went lower pitched. And there I've made that completely musical out of almost exactly the same phrase. So try to think about these things when you're freestyling, right? Because it's quite... freestyling can feel like a really daunting thing to do. And so lots of people, they just kind of noodle and they don't think too much about what's coming out. Some people just nail musicality beautifully, but lots of people really struggle with it. So it's really helpful just to have that like one or two things and then change something very small about it. You know, just a little high note at the end versus a low note at the end. Or maybe just change the last part of the phrase and that'll make all of the difference. Now, the other technique to talk about is contrast. So music is all about contrast. Okay, it's all about building tension and then releasing that tension. Regardless of whether you operate in jazz or swing or blues or dance music. I mean dance music is like really obvious, right? A massive build up that's often anxiety inducing, followed by a drop that just suddenly is like, oh yeah, cool, now I can dance. And you've got to do the same sort of thing basically with your scratching. So I'm going to put a beat on. I'll put a slow beat on. And the first one I'm going to kind of go through is speed. So slow versus fast. So have a little listen to the phrase I'm going to do and just see what it feels like. So first one I'm going to do is going to be all the same speed. And then I'm going to do one afterwards that has like a variation and goes a little bit faster in a little area. And see whether you think they sound more musical or not. Okay, it's alright. Kind of like, yeah, it's on the beat, it's rolling, I kind of feel a groove. But now let's vary the speed a little bit. So, ready? Okay, suddenly you feel this kind of movement, don't you, right? You kind of... There's almost like a swing and a sway to it. It flows in a different way. And that's just by using the contrast of speed versus... of slow versus fast. Now, there's an art to doing that, though. So, you know, for example... You don't really necessarily want to start super fast and then slow down. It normally works better going the other way around. So I'd normally suggest that you start with a slower riff and then go faster. You can do both, but I tend to find that speed is most musical when it's used to kind of bring the whole phrase to a crescendo. So I'm going to show you some examples. If you started with speed and then went slow, it would be like this, okay? Waiting for the one. Right, here we go. It's okay. It sounds kind of okay because they're across two different phrases, right? But you kind of lose a bit of momentum. I think it works quite well if you're coming from someone in a circle. You know, if you're at a jam, you're coming from someone who's just been doing high speed. Can be quite a nice way to carry on what they're doing. But generally it sounds a bit better if you do it the other way around. So something like this. Okay, so I think that's a much nicer way to flow it. And what you're doing there is you're kind of getting people into a groove, and and then you're kind of building this crescendo right towards the end, where you then just drop it back into the sensible speed that it's supposed to be. Right? So that's a really nice way to do it. Another way to do it is to move between them quite quickly. So I'll give you an example, something like this. Okay, you see how like there's this kind of like fast bit followed by slow bit followed by fast bit followed by slow bit. That kind of gives the listener, it's almost kind of got two rhythms that they can move to, the fast bit and the slow bit. So kind of drawing between those two in that way can be a really, really nice way to do it. The other sort of type of, I guess, contrast that you can do with scratching is really about, I didn't have a great name for this, so I called it pitched versus rhythmic. And what I mean by pitched when you're scratching is, there's that's what the record sounds like at normal speed, right? So pitched to me is where you're making use of speeding the record up to get a more harsher hit that's a higher pitch, or doing it slower to get a lower pitch. And the thing with that is that basically you're going to get like, you're going to find that there are some phrases that are more about the kind of record control than they are about rhythm. And putting some contrast between doing very rhythmic phrases and very kind of pitch-focused phrases can be really cool. So for example, let's try another beat. Let's get this one on. Right. So here, right, I'm going to do more of a pitched focus one. And then I'm going to do a rhythmic one so that you can tell the difference first. So let's do that. So here's pitch. Okay, so that's more pitched, right? I'm going up and down quite a lot. I'm doing that by manipulating the speed at which I'm moving the record. Right, a rhythmic one is going to be more like this. See what I mean? It's like kind of constantly moving on a rhythm. The pitch stays relatively the same, and it's more about those rhythmic hits, right? So the most musical thing is where you combine those two together and you contrast them, right? So imagine what I did before with the pitch stuff, and then moving into something more rhythmic. So it might sound something like this. See? So there, I've got a few different things going on, right? When you're listening back to that, I was moving between having kind of lots of record controls and more pitched. I then moved into something very clearly rhythmic with the kind of stab forward scratch pattern. Right, and then back into something that was a bit more pitched. So I was doing that. I was also moving from slow to fast, right? Quite a lot of the time in that, and quite regularly tripping between those things. So you're kind of starting to move and motion with me as I kind of change between those, right? And on top of that, I had some structure in there too. It was an A-B-A-C structure, largely. There were quite a lot of variation between the two sets, the two questions, the two A's, right? But on the whole, it generally followed that. So, if you start to think about these things more holistically, right? So, one thing I'm going to totally recommend that you do, right, is record all of your freestyles. I'm putting a load out on TikTok and on like whatever at the moment. I just recorded like an hour of me basically just freestyling. And what I wanted to do was basically then go back and analyze all of that and look at, am I deploying like all of those techniques? How often am I doing them? How effective are they? Like when I listen to it back. Because what happens a lot of the time when you're freestyling, it's all coming out. You don't necessarily control it. You don't necessarily put conscious thought to it. And the problem with that is what you end up with some freestyles that come out and you're like, that was cool. And you get some freestyles that just sound like a big wobbly mess, or they're not in time, or they just don't seem to have any direction or structure. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get rid of that, right? I'm trying to get rid of that by consciously watching what I'm doing and thinking about what I'm doing. And so I recommend you do the same, right? Record a whole load of freestyling, right? And then watch it all back and go, okay, I used, there was some structure to that. I can identify A, B, A, C, or A, B, or, A, B, A, B, or A, B, C, D, or whatever, right? Whatever your structural thing looks like. Am I then using some form of contrast, between pitched versus rhythmic or fast versus slow? And where am I using those? Am I using them effectively to build, or am I using them to swing people in and out of a particular rhythm? And then I guess the other question is, does it fit with the music? So for example, the cuts that I might do over this, they're likely to be a lot more rhythmic with a little bit of pitching, right? Because it's a very hard rhythm, right? So it's going to be more of this sort of thing. Right, that's still very, very rhythmic in its nature. There was a little bit of kind of moving the platter around and mucking about, but it was very, very rhythmic, right? I think we can all agree on that. Whereas if I'm going to do a slightly slower beat, let's go real slow. Let's go with a 90 BPM. Right, this is going to be much, there's going to be a lot more variation I could do to this. So I can kind of come in and go. I see there's loads, right? So there is a little bit of listening back and thinking, all right, well, did that actually work over that beat? If you do a lot of dance music, you're probably going to be more rhythmic than you are pitch, right? Because that's all about energy and it's all just about rhythm and it's like, yeah, fire, right? But if you're doing something more hip-hop-y, then you probably are going to want to do a lot more variation, right? So definitely give that a shot. The other thing I would do as well is, like, watch some videos on melody. There's loads on YouTube, and because melody's one of those things that like obviously gets taught in like basically any instrument like based class, right? So piano, all those kind of things can actually be really, there's loads of really good teachers out there for instruments, right? So it's not like, because the challenge you often have with DJing is that because there's no kind of formal syllabus, there's no grades, there's no any of that. What you have is a lot of people like me, right? Passionate DJs who just want to share some knowledge, but they don't necessarily have, the kind of learning background, the curriculum, that kind of stuff, right? And so it can be a bit dodgy trying to find good material that actually helps you online when you're looking specifically in DJing. But if you look at melody more generally, and actually look at if you look at there's a guy, EDM Tips. So he's got one where he talks through the whole thing of building out a melody and how to do that, but he's doing it from the point of view of building EDM, right? And he's doing it in Ableton. But it will give you all of the things that I'm talking about here. It will talk you through and give you a visual demonstration just of how to actually do that stuff, which is really, 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 really helpful. So I would strongly recommend having a little look online for how to build good melodies, and then just apply exactly the same theory to scratching. I'm just going to have a little check to see if there are any questions on any of the live streams. If you've got any questions or anything you want me to cover, now's the time to jump in and just say so. Give me 2 seconds. I've just got crying faces from Matt and Gecko. So that's helpful. Anyway, one last thing to say is, if you enjoy these sessions and you're trying to improve your scratching, right, check out my course. If you're on a load of channels, it's at the bottom. If you're on TikTok, you have to go to courses.mrbigmouthbeats.com or head over to my profile and have a look at the link. I've got a full course, online course there. I'm a scratch DJ, but I'm also 10 years worth of organisational psychology, where I work specifically in kind of high performance and learning. So I've built the course to be very, very easy and digestible, to help you kind of progress through in the simplest possible way. But it's also super handy if I got no fucking time, right? Or or I don't really know what I'm doing, or I've hit a barrier, There's stuff in there to support you through all of those kind of journeys. So look, to finish up, I'm just going to hit a bit of a freestyle, but thank you all for coming, and I'm here every week. Thanks for coming, folks. See you next week.